This video is going to be about things that I think are good mods and or gimmicks on four-wheel drives. You may disagree with this stuff, but the comments section is wide open for debates. I'm doing this video to take a bit of a break from building the troop carrier, because I've been doing it a bit too long now, and I need a change of scenery. Anyway, if you're sitting comfortably, then I will begin. Now, as we already know, my daily driver is the 76 of Dreams. If you don't know anything about it, here's a video. So now that you've seen that, you'll know it's not exactly a factory standard. So while it's had a lot of stuff done to it, a lot of that stuff is pretty unnecessary for making it through the tracks. So this video will be about the best mods that I think every four-wheel drive should have and why I think so. Starting with engines, because without them we wouldn't get anywhere. Now the first thing I'll talk about is what every diesel owner froths over: catch cans. Now a catch can works directly to combat the horrible things that an EGR system does. And if you don't know what EGR does, there are many videos out there explaining it. But I'll give you a very brief visual representation so that you fully understand. So now you fully understand how a catch can works. Not very appealing, right? How do you think your car feels about this? Also, the combination of exhaust gases and oil from your intake creates a horrendous sludge that needs cleaning out once in a while. And there are a few methods of helping with this, which is why people fit catch cans. And here it is. So to summarize, when combustion happens in your engine, there's something called blow-by, which is basically exhaust gases escaping into your crankcase. And if they don't go anywhere, every seal in your engine decides to turn inside out. So what manufacturers do is they route these gases into the intake so they're burnt again. And a result of this is that oil particles make it into this exhaust gas, which in turn ends up in your intake. Hence why you get an oily intake. So this piece here is the crankcase breather, feeding directly into the catch can. The catch can then filters this oil out of the air and returns the air back to the intake. And all this means is that every once in a while you have to drain your catch can, but that's better than stripping a V8 intake that takes about 3 days. Now I personally don't want a sludgy intake, which is why I think a catch can is a good modification. Other things you can do to help is to remove your EGR system from your car, but I don't know anybody who's had this done. I would even go as far as to say that if you have had your EGR removed, you probably don't desperately need a catch can, simply because the sludge is only formed by the combination of exhaust gases and oil in the intake. So if you take away one of these ingredients, it doesn't form. But we'll leave that to the masses to dispute. Now there's also a lot of debate about inline fuel filters, or whether to put them before or after the factory fuel filter. Now both of them have advantages and disadvantages, which is why I've chosen to only use the factory filter. If you've decided to opt for a pre-filter, I personally think this is only useful if it has its own alarm system, because otherwise all that happens is the filter clogs up, you don't know anything about it, and then your factory one fills up as normal, which means there's almost no advantage unless you're changing both the filters regularly, which you should be doing anyway. Now this would only do anything if you're using a finer filter as a pre-filter, because if you're using the same as the factory, then what's the point? And with this, if you're using a finer filter, you have to make sure you're using a bigger filter, otherwise you're creating a vacuum in the system caused by the blockage of the finer filter, which from what I've seen, a lot of people do not do. The result is extra load on your fuel pump, which could actually cause problems with fueling at the top end. Anyway, This is why I run a factory filter and nothing else. Fight below. And that concludes the engine. So I guess now it's time to talk about lights. Now there are good lights and there are bad lights. Allow me to demonstrate. Good. 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 Not good. Allow me to justify this. When you're rock crawling at night or trying to find a campsite, side lights are bloody fantastic. And when you're driving on an open road at night, spotlights are also great. However, the only reason I can see for using a roof-mounted light bar is if you decide in the middle of the night that you want to look at your bonnet. Or hood, if you're that way inclined. Now I didn't fit these, and if I was going to mod my own car from scratch, I definitely wouldn't have a roof-mounted light bar. Now in other news, if you're going to do a lot of solo travelling like I do, I think a winch is one of the things you absolutely must have. Now I recently upgraded mine. This one's now a worn £12,000 winch, which I managed to snipe from an ARB sale. But otherwise, my previous winch was absolutely fine, and I wouldn't have thought there was any need to go above the £9,500 that was on there before. Now I changed mine a little bit. First of all, I opted for some Dyneema rope, mostly for the weight saving, and also because I like my fingers. Now the rope that I removed is about 10 kilos of wire, as opposed to the 1 or 2 kilos for the Dyneema rope. I also opted for the flat link. This is simply because it works better when you're not using it. I don't really see there's any advantage over an actual hook. Now this one isn't any special brand, it's exactly the same as a particular famous brand, just with a different name on it. And I've tested it pretty heavily, especially at Monkey Gum, when it managed to get me up a near vertical winching situation without any issues whatsoever. Now this can tie in quite nicely with the bull bar. There it is. This is just a factory Toyota one. And I personally think if you've got a 79, 78 or a 76 series, the factory winch bar is the best one that's available. It's also the cheapest. So that's just something to consider if you're thinking about mods. More expensive is not always better. Now going back to recovery stuff, I've got these two generic recovery points. Now they're nothing special, but to be honest I think they're a bit obsolete if you've got a working winch. Simply because I'd much rather winch myself out of a situation than get snatched out, just because it reduces all the stresses on everything. Now these particular mounts are made of 12mm thick steel and they cost me about $50. And if you know anything about the properties of materials, paying more for recovery points doesn't change the fact that 12mm thickness of steel is not going anywhere whatever you do to it. So even though they don't have a fancy name or fancy testing, I have no doubts that they'll survive any kind of recovery. Now one final gripe before I talk about actual things are hype trains selling semi-useless things. Now unfortunately, I fell for the hype of Legendex because of 4-wheel drive 24/7 saying they're the strongest and best things money can buy. Now unfortunately this is not the case at all. Let me explain why. Now this piece of steel here is resting against the furthest sticking out part of my bodywork. And this gap here is how far the Legendex slider comes out. From another perspective, you can see how this works. Now maybe I have the wrong expectations of rock sliders, but my expectations are that the rock sliders protect the bodywork and chassis from rocks, which this does not do. Now my only explanation is that they've used a generic template when designing them, made sure they fit in the loosest sense, and then sold them on with the least amount of R&D possible. But in my opinion, they need to be around 50mm further out, because at the moment they're bloody useless. So in terms of communication, I use a GME XRS 330, and I actually think it's bloody good. I've had a few other radios in the past, one of which is a 40 channel, which ruined a few trips for me by deciding one day that it wants to act as a one-way radio. I'm not sure why, but I've replaced it with this and it's been fantastic. Now while it's got a load of funky features, it's also got an app that connects to your phone via Bluetooth. And what this allows you to do is actually locate another radio user using a map. Now I'm not sure if this only works for other GME users, but I think in terms of rescue, it's definitely the most useful thing to have on a radio. Yes, back in here again. Now I don't really tend to use that much power when I'm out on the tracks or camping, simply because I'm only there for 1 or 2 nights at a time, and the only thing that's running all the time is going to be the fridge. So in all honesty, I would probably be completely fine with just the starting battery and nothing else. But I've decided to completely overkill my car by adding 50 kilos of batteries to make sure it's able to survive about 2 weeks off-grid without solar panels for no real reason. I might need to rethink this in the future. So here's how it is. This is obviously the main cranking battery, which is connected to this second battery via a red arc smart relay. And in the back of the car in the draw system, I have a third deep cycle battery connected to that second battery in series. Now if you know your electrics, you'll see that that's not exactly the best setup because of battery balancing. Now I've been considering setting up a DC-DC charger for this rear battery, but it's one of those things that's in the pipeline that I'll probably get to once all my batteries have been taken out by this poor setup. So if you want a bit more information on what I think is a good 12-volt setup, check out this video of the troopy build, because that explains a more compact way of doing things. Now for tyres, I usually run all-terrains, just because they make less noise on the highway. Now my last car, the Navara, had a set of muddies on it for a few thousand kilometers, and those things howled like a single mother. So moving to all-terrains after that was a breath of fresh air. Now while they might not be the absolute pinnacle in terms of capability, I think they're a good all-rounder, hence the name. And I'll probably get another set once these ones wear out, although I'm kind of toying with the idea of getting 35s. Now you can't tell by looking at it, but this car's twin locked, and that's via 2 Arb Air Lockers. Now in this case, 2 lockers is better than 1, and I personally think that if you're going to get one of them if you can't afford both, get a rear locker. Because without a doubt it's more effective than just a front locker, and if you do decide to get just a front locker, you must be a fan of this guy. So I guess next on the list is suspension. Now I've got 2 inches of Old Man Emu lift in here, and to be honest I wouldn't really go any higher. Now my reasoning for this is that landcruisers are already tippy as it is, and the higher you lift it, the higher the centre of gravity and the more likely you are to roll over. Now I think this generally applies to any vehicle. Now my personal choice is to get the largest tyres you can with the lowest lift possible, purely for the reasons I just mentioned. Hence why if I did go to 35s, I wouldn't get an extra lift, if I could get away with it. I'd rather cut guards than lift it higher. So at the back of the car, I've got the Kmart swing away, but I've only got 1 tyre, even though I have both swing away arms. This is because I don't really see the point in having 2 spare tyres, on the very slim chance I'll need both. Now I carry tyre repair kits and tyre plugs with me, which means that if the plug doesn't save it, I've got the spare tyre to use. And to be honest, that's a risk I'm willing to take, considering the trips that I go on. Now as I mentioned before, I've got a set of Arb lockers in this car, and obviously to run them, you need an air supply. And coming from the industry that I do, double redundancy is one of those things you can't really overlook. And Arb compressors don't exactly have a stellar reputation in this area. So that's why I've got 2 compressors. One at the front in the engine bay that can operate the lockers by itself. And then I also have the dual compressor under here, which I use for filling my tyres. Now I've set them up so you can use either compressor for either function, just in case one of them does fail, because I've been down several tracks that you wouldn't actually get through unless you had lockers, and getting out of them would be the same ordeal, so losing lockers is one of those things that I don't really want to do. I also make sure I'm carrying enough spares to sort myself out if anything does go wrong. And for this reason, I carry a length of spare nylon hose just in case anything needs repairing. Now, as we already know, usually you're driving to get somewhere, and you're usually spending the night somewhere, which is why I always carry one of these in the car. You might notice it looks a little bit different from one of the standard ones you buy from Milwaukee. This is why. Now when you buy this chainsaw, it comes with a 6-inch bar. This is not a 6-inch bar. And as long as you're careful with your setup, you can get away with using a much larger bar. Here's why. So this is the standard chain that comes with the chainsaw, and as you can see, there's a cutting tooth on every link. Whereas on the replacement, there's only a cutting tooth on every other link, which means that you're going to get less drag when you're using it, and in turn, that puts less load on the motor, which means that, in theory, you can get away with using a longer bar so you can cut bigger things, without having to upgrade the motor or overload it. Now everything I've put on here just bolts in with no modifications. And if you're looking to do this yourself, it's an Oregon 575271. Now you know. I guess the only disadvantage is that the guard no longer fits properly. So that concludes my lecture on things that I think are useful in a four-wheel drive. But I've forgotten one thing. Shameless self-promotion. So hopefully the next video will be more interesting and troopy related. But here's a quick update of things that have happened in the background. And unfortunately, it doesn't look anywhere near as intact as it did before. So brace yourselves. So now you have closure and are able to sleep at night.